This is Weston Row Station, now Pearse Station, in the heart of Dublin. It was here in the summer of 1917 that the turning of the tide, the massive political change in Ireland post the 1916 Rising, was seen most dramatically. Hundreds of Irish political prisoners who had been held in jails in England since the 1916 Rising were released. They were brought across the Irish Sea to Donncha, and they were brought in trains here to Weston Row Station, as it was then, now Pearse Station. Thousands of people were here to greet them. There were bands playing, there were people outside on the streets. Bhí tíde ag casa, tháinig ahrú mór neon an phobal ón éirí amach. The tide, the political tide had turned. People now looked to the Republicans who had taken part in the 1916 Rising as the future of Ireland. Among the Republican prisoners who were welcomed here by the crowds on that day was Countess Markievicz, who had been imprisoned here in Dublin and in England after the 1916 Rising. She was welcomed by her comrades from the Irish Transport and General Workers Union and from the Irish Citizen Army, with whom she had fought in the 1916 Rising. The thousands of people on the streets greeted her as she emerged, and she was taken in a horse and carriage across the Liffey to Liberty Hall, where a formal welcome was organised. And those scenes were replicated all over the country as prisoners from different parts of Ireland were welcomed home. And indeed, the experience in the prisons in Frongach internment camp and the various prisons in England, they had helped to mould a new Republican movement, which on that day here in Dublin ushered in a new political era. In that year, 1917, and on into 1918, Sinn Féin won a succession of by-election victories that showed again the way that the tide had turned, the repression forced on Ireland by the British government, censorship, imprisonment of hundreds of people, the banning of Gaelic games, the banning of Sinn Féin, Cumann na mBan, and all kinds of national activities had met with a huge response from the Irish people. The reaction, of course, to the executions of the men, the 16 who were executed after the 1916 Rising, and the reaction also to the horrendous slaughter of the First World War, the imperialist war into which Ireland was dragged against our will. This was the reason that there was such a surge of support to Sinn Féin. And also they realised that the Home Rule Party, led by John Redmond and subsequently John Dillon, had completely failed. They had participated in Westminster only to be treated with contempt by the British government, even though they had persuaded thousands of young Irishmen to join the British Army in that conflict and to lose their lives. Still, there was no prospect of Home Rule by the British government. In fact, the British government had brought unionism, Tory unionists, into the administration during the war. So people now turned to Sinn Féin. This is Dublin's Mansion House, one of Dublin's and indeed Ireland's most historic buildings, where many momentous events took place. In April 1918, the British government announced their intention to impose conscription in Ireland, compulsory military service in the British Army. Within days of that announcement, a massive national campaign of resistance had been organised, and it began here in the Mansion House when the leaders of Sinn Féin, the Irish Party and the Irish trade union movement met together and gathered to organise that campaign. Within a few days of that meeting, a national petition had been signed by hundreds of thousands of people across Ireland. And the following day, there was a general strike, the largest general strike in the history of the Irish trade union movement. This was April 1918. The following month, in May, the British government concocted what they called the German plot. And through this plot, they arrested the leaders of Sinn Féin. Most of those leaders remained in prison throughout the summer and autumn of 1918. On the 11th of November, the armistice was signed, and it brought an end to the horrific imperialist war which had brought the deaths of millions of people, including up to 40,000 Irishmen in the British Army. On the 11th of November, on the day of the armistice, Sinn Féin met here in the Mansion House in the Round Room and announced their intention at a mass meeting to contest the general election which would come after the war was over. They published a manifesto which committed them to an Irish Republic. They made very clear that they would stand in that election on a platform of Irish unity and independence, an unequivocal call for freedom and independence and a republic in Ireland. That manifesto was censored in the newspapers by the British authorities. There was military repression, candidates were arrested, 3 Sinn Féin directors of election were arrested, offices were raided, material was seized, and many of the Sinn Féin candidates were in prison. But of those who remained of the Sinn Féin leaders, these included Cathal Brugha, Michael Collins, Harry Boland. These men, and indeed Republican women in Cumann na mBan, they organised the election effort and they stood candidates throughout the 32 counties. The result of that election exceeded all expectations of Sinn Féin. Sinn Féin won 73 out of the 105 parliamentary seats in Ireland, a stunning victory for the Republic. It was very clear to everybody at this stage that nothing less than complete unity and independence would satisfy the Irish people. As soon as the election results were known, preparations began to assemble the first Dáil Éireann on Chéad Dáil Éireann. Bhí sé sin mar policy ag Sinn Féin le blianta fada, ach anois bhí sé le bheith ann, bhí trionól na hÉireann, Poblacht na hÉireann le bheith ann. The preparations began here in the Mansion House, again on the 7th of January 1919. The gathering organised that day, which would be the 21st of January 1919, when the elected representatives would gather to assemble in the inaugural meeting of An Chéad Dáil Éireann, the first Dáil Éireann. On that day, thousands of people were gathered here in Dawson Street to witness the arrival of the Teachtaí Dála, the TDs, and the guests and visitors from all over the world, not only from all over Ireland, who came here on that day. By a strange coincidence, the Royal Dublin Fusiliers, prisoners of war who had been in Germany and who had returned to Dublin, were hosted here in the Mansion House for a breakfast. As they emerged from the Mansion House, the crowds were here awaiting the Sinn Féin assembly. The delegates, the TDs were here, and as the Dublin Fusiliers marched off, the Sinn Féin assembled crowd marched into the Mansion House for this most historic day. It was here in the round room of the Mansion House, which ironically had been built as a ballroom for King George IV when he visited Dublin in 1821. It was here that An Chéad Dáil Éireann gathered. The crowds were on Dawson Street. The delegates and the TDs walked in through these gates here into the Mansion House, into the round room, through the double doors. And there was no great ceremony. The Teachtaí Dála simply walked together up through the round room to the platform, where the only decoration was a single tricolour Brotach na hÉireann. The Cathaoirleach, the Ceann Comhairle, on the first day of An Chéad Dáil Éireann was Cathal Brugha, a long-time Republican Gaelic League activist from Dublin. He represented the Waterford constituency, including the Waterford Gaeltacht. When Cathal Brugha called on representatives to read the Declaration of Independence, he said that Táimid críochnatha anois le Sasana, we are now finished with England. It was a clear declaration of separation from the British Empire. The delegates assembled, the TDs assembled, and hundreds, in fact thousands of people from all over Ireland gathered here. They heard the Declaration of Independence read in Irish and in English. They heard a message to the free nations of the world read also in Irish, English and French. And they heard the democratic programme, which was a progressive programme of social and economic democracy. Those documents were read and distributed to the newspapers, the press of the world, who were here also on that historic day. It was made very clear that the separation from England was now the demand of the Irish people. One of the many young Republicans here on that day was Máire Comerford, a young member of Cumann from Wexford. She's left great description of the feeling of those present. She said that never was the past so near or the future so full of hope. She also spoke of the preparations in the Mansion House and the Round Room itself. They feared, in fact, that they could be raided and the TDs and leaders of Sinn Féin arrested, and they actually had escape routes from here in the Mansion House ready. She said that the Mansion House was a very old building and a place of many secrets, so they had their escape route planned. As it happened, there was no need for that escape. The day's events passed without incident, but everybody who was present was left in no doubt that a new era in Irish history had begun. What would the response of the British government based here in Dublin Castle be? On the very day the first Dáil Éireann met in the Mansion House, there was also one of the first armed challenges to British rule in Ireland. British rule based here in Dublin Castle. That event happened in Solohead Beg, County Tipperary, when a local IRA unit attacked an RUC patrol in a raid for arms. The response was coordinated here in Dublin Castle. First, the political response. There was to be no recognition of Dáil Éireann. There was to be no recognition of Irish independence. In fact, there was to be an armed, repressive response to that. That was led by Lord French, the British Lord Lieutenant, one of the top generals in the imperialist war, who had been brought into Ireland effectively as a military dictator. Later in 1919, the wave of repression was intensified. Dáil Éireann was driven underground. And from here in Dublin Castle, the British spies, the RIC, the British Army were directed in Dublin and throughout the country to hunt down Republicans, not only members of the IRA, but TDs, political representatives, and the Republican government had to function in secret. But the people continued to rally to that government. In the months that followed, repression intensified, but so also did Irish resistance, both political and military. In 1920, Sinn Féin received further support, enhanced support in local government elections. Throughout the countryside and here in Dublin, the war intensified also. The Irish Republican Army was organised in flying columns, and the people supported the Republican movement. They stood by the Irish Republic, proclaimed and declared independence in the Mansion House on the 21st of January 1919.